Debating in Dubai now, where a panel of local experts discuss the tension in the Middle East, from the uprising across the Arab world to the rising price of oil. It's all there in Dateline, up next.
Hello and welcome to a special edition of Dateline London from Dubai Men's College in the Gulf, where a major education conference, Education Without Borders, has been taking place at a time of great ferment all across the Arab world. To guide us through events from Egypt and Tunisia, from Libya to Yemen and Bahrain, I'm joined here at the Higher Colleges of Technology by Francis Matthew of Gulf News here in Dubai. Hello. Abdul Aziz Saga from Dubai's Gulf Research Centre, Hassan Fatah of the National in Abu Dhabi, and Kate Durian of Platts. Let's begin with Libya, Abdul Aziz. Do you see this now as the beginning of the end for the Gaddafi regime with all these defections that have been taking place?
I think it is, but I mean, I'd like to start by saying that there was an international and regional consensus about what's happening in Libya. We have seen the GCC Council, and also the Arab League, the OIC organization, and the Security Council.
So Islamic States, the
there
Gulf
is Islamic
Cooperation
State,
Council,
there's a
all
Gulf,
behind us.
and all the Arab countries behind. In fact, the whole initiation of the no-fly zone started from the Arab League. And today, if it wasn't the no-fly zone and the activity of the NATO and the international forces in supporting the rebellion and the civilian there for their safety and life, it would have been a massacre killing, and it would have been, Gaddafi would have done a mass killing for his own people, as we have seen it in the beginning of the movement. The question is today, how long can they survive and where would they survive? I think the international forces and the NATO forces are playing a significant role to help and assist all the rebellion to stop the Gaddafi. Now we have at least the Gaddafi Air Force cannot use its Air Force. Tank that targeting and attacking the people have been clearly identified and targeted there. The support of the rebellion to move forward to the cities, it's under the way in a good progress. Of course, they are less capable than the Gaddafi regime, ability of forces and the amount of resources that he has. But at the same time, it has been cleared, the two issues being separated. One is the whole issue of the no-fly zone and the safety of the rebellion, and second, the change of regime.
But Francis, this is a regime which has got to be hollowed out from the inside, hasn't it? Because if we're leaving up to the rebels to do it, a few guys with machine guns on the back of pickup trucks is not going to defeat Gaddafi's forces.
It doesn't look like it, because you see these guys running around, and a lot of people support them. We all support them, because the regime is a horrible regime, but it's got 10 times as many soldiers, they're organised, and you've got this bizarre contrast between the UN Security Council resolution, which is strictly in favour of looking after civilians, and yet the main players' overt desire to regime change. And there's a mismatch.
Well, your newspaper today had a cartoon showing Barack Obama saying we want the regime to change, it's just we're not in favour of regime change, which does suggest a degree of confusion.
We'll confuse him out of power.
Confuse Gaddafi out of power, confuse dictator as perhaps a dictator on his way out. I mean, do you agree that there is this broad consensus of support for what is happening, providing it stays within the strict limits of the UN?
Well, certainly the political inertia and even the military inertia is on the side of the rebels. The question is how long this will take. And what is increasingly clear is this may well take a very, very long time.
And the question is whether outside powers have the stomach for it. It costs a lot of money, it takes a lot of political will to keep, for instance, aircraft carriers in the Gulf of Sip.
Certainly that, and also to maintain the coalition as it stands now. But just as important is whether the rebels themselves are able to basically keep up the fight. They are a ragtag army right now. They don't have the level of discipline as the other side does. I think one of the questions will be whether they will have any further defections from the army itself. That's what helped them in the very beginning, and I think would help them further.
Kate, I mean, how do you see this? Because as we've suggested, the rebels themselves are perhaps not capable of doing it, but if there are further high-level defections, Gaddafi may realise that the only way is to leave.
I think, this man has been ruling for more than 41 years, and he's not going to give up that easily. He actually truly believes in his, this Jamahiriya that he created. But I think the defections are a sign that, people are leaving a sinking ship. But, there is another alternative, and that you are seeing at the moment the rebels setting up their headquarters in Benghazi, getting themselves organized, preparing to sell oil with the help of the Qataris, apparently. So you might even get a situation where you've got, the eastern provinces sort of under rebel control with some legitimacy because they've been recognized by certain powers, including the Qataris, and Gaddafi with hardly any oil, sort of cloistered in Bab al-Azizi. He's not very easy to get to.
To widen this discussion a little bit, in Syria, we have Bashar al-Assad making a speech which was widely seen, at least here in the Gulf, as being very, very disappointing in terms of promising vaguely reform, but actually not giving an inch to the people there who are demonstrating in the streets.
Well, it was unfortunate to hear such a statement from President Bashar al-Assad. Everybody have expected, anticipated a much more forward-coming and addressing the issue of the people. The people have not demanded, the falling of the regime or the change of the regime. People have demanded a legitimate demands, and we were expecting to see the abandoning of the emergency law, the steps of reform have a definition of time to say when these things will happen. There was no definition of time when things will happen. The political and economic measures that were supposed to be announced, none of it was announced. In fact, we have seen a sort of analytical, journalistic, more of unexpected, honestly, speech. Everybody was looking, toward that, but then it was disappointing in the end of the day.
These countries, what's interesting is for an outsider looking at the Arab world, we see some of the things in common, we see unrest, but each place is quite different. Syria is clearly different from Libya, as is Bahrain, where there's a great deal of interest from the GCC countries, the Gulf countries, in stability in Bahrain, where they want reform in other places.
Bahrain is a different case. I mean, there you've got a desire for some of the reforms which the king announced when he first came to power almost 10 years ago. And you've got a moderate opposition who are willing to indulge in some dialogue. Wifaq Party said that they wanted to talk to the Crown Prince last 2 or 3 days ago. So there is a desire from the moderate opposition to have this discussion. And then there's a much more radical opposition who are quite clear that they want regime change. And so the government's struggling there with trying to see a way forward.
But that was very interesting because the moderate opposition this week in Bahrain said, we want the Iranians to keep out of this because there's a great fear here that there is, quote, Iranian meddling going on in Bahrain.
I think everybody wants it to be a Bahraini solution for Bahrain. And there are Iranians who would love to get their fingers in there. There are others trying to mediate. And the GCC's position has said quite clearly, we're here to hold the ring. As the GCC forces go in to support the Bahrainis, we're holding the ring so that Bahrain sorts out its own problems.
Do you see that this developing a different pace and in different ways in different countries then? And
Certainly.
So to think of an Arab Spring does suggest the things in common, but the differences are also very great, and we should emphasize those too.
Well, let's be honest. I mean, Tunisia happened almost 3 months ago. Egypt ended about 2.5 months ago or so. They haven't actually been really resolved. You've lost leaders, but the main leaders, but you actually haven't seen the new development, the new governments in place, new leadership in place, and so I think the euphoria has actually begun to wear off, especially now that you have Libya, and Libya is becoming far more complicated and difficult, and the other countries as well.
Well, so yeah, I was going to say.
So the biggest danger is in painting this with a broad brush.
A historian in Britain said to me recently, the thing is, you can have a revolution, but it doesn't necessarily put food on the plate. It doesn't necessarily mean you get a job. So you can have an Arab Spring, but come the autumn, if things haven't changed, for instance, for the bulk of the Egyptian people, we may see a very different reaction.
But that's the crux of it. I think corruption is something that is sort of endemic as well. You've had dynastic rule, you've had nepotism, the Assads have been ruling Syria for decades, you've had the same in Egypt, and I think people just want food on the table, they want jobs, they want a future.
You see, that in itself is very interesting because the old Sherlock Holmes thing is, remember the dog that didn't bark. There have been a lot of things that have not been happening. Where are the Islamists in all this, for example?
Well, there is 2 points I think I wanted to mention. One, we have not seen any American or Israeli flag have been burnt. So this proves that it's all domestic driven. And at the same time, we have not seen too many green flags. being shown there. So it means it's not an Islamist movement. But at the same time, I think the two power that we need to watch in the future is the military, in case if something goes wrong, not in place, no development, no democracy, political party, NGOs not being, playing their role. We may see those moderate Islamist party, and again we have seen and witnessed a change in the West opinion with regard to the moderate Islamic party like the Muslim Brotherhood. We have seen a positive signal being sent from the West to this party, and this party now have differentiated between their political activity and their ideology belief there. And I assume they've just had a meeting in Istanbul just to reorganize themselves, the Muslim Brotherhood international organization, and to address many and various issues that they need to do. On the other hand, they seems to be also sending positive signals. They said we could be the countering for the Islamist radicals. We are not going to demand more than 20% in the case of Egypt. We're not going to run for presidency. So they're sending a lot of soft messages to comfort the rest. But of course, they cannot be antagonized. I think they are the only organized power on the ground.
Right.
That tend to take a great advantage of that.
I mean, that could change.
It could change,
but it takes months.
It takes months, and it takes time, and it takes also. I mean, when you look at a country like Libya, there is no institutional in place. You see, there is no civil society in place. So all of that is going to take time until such things is being built up.
That's always been the Western fear, hasn't it? There's always been this kind of false choice. You either have to have a dictator that you may not like, or you will end up with some kind of Al-Qaeda supporting Islamist government. And the interesting thing is, a lot of these people on the streets have proved that isn't the case. That is not the choice. There's another choice.
And that third choice, the more secular, more modern, and certainly much more young choice, is no less Muslim. The guys in Tahrir Square were Muslims.
Yes.
And so, so what is wonderful in the Arab world now is that for the rest, from now on, we know that it doesn't have to be Islamically led or statist led. There is a third choice, which is a perfectly valid choice for a Muslim to choose, a secular option.
You've been looking at a youth survey this week,
yes,
which is very, very interesting, isn't it? Because people want democracy, but they also want traditional values.
The Arab Youth Survey came out with these figures very clear. They want democracy, education, jobs, all these normal things. But over 70% of them said, we value traditional values. So they're no way becoming sort of mock Westerners or lost Mid-Atlantic kids. They are Arabs who want to be Arab.
I mean, do you see all this as quite optimistic then?
Yeah, quite, in fact. I think, look, for the past decade, the West has looked at this region with the lens of Al-Qaeda and terrorism and the global war on terror. And suddenly all that has been thrown out the door. Right? We haven't seen any of those players on the ground. Quite the contrary.
Doesn't mean to say they're not there, though, does it?
Well, certainly it doesn't mean they're not there, but it doesn't mean that they are not there. But certainly it underscores that they are not major players. They are not the mainstream.
And they're not what the people, as far as we can see from the people in Tahrir Square and elsewhere, it's not what they want. It's
certainly not. And in fact, that they can engage in dialogue and debate and discussion and do it peacefully.
Now, I said at the beginning of our conversation, we're here because there's a huge education conference. Yeah. People in this region are talking very much about education for all, making this in effect the education century. I just wonder how you feel about that, because it's fine to get educated, like Mohamed Bouazizi in Tunisia, and then you can't get a job, exactly. The police repress you, and in his case he committed suicide. So, I mean, that was the kick-off point for all this.
I think that's the crux of it. I mean, when you look at the region, most of the population is more than 50% of the population is under 25. And there aren't, even education doesn't really prepare them very much for private sector jobs. So you need to create more private sector jobs, you need to create more jobs in the sort of knowledge economy, which we're very weak on as well in this part of the world. But I think the wonderful thing that's come out of the revolutions in Tunisia and Egypt is that the youth in the Arab world now have heroes to look up to, and it's not Al-Qaeda. If you are given a role model like the Egyptian youth in Tahrir Square, or even I mean, Libya is a youth-led movement as well, then, if you have a choice of going out, making change peacefully, and then building yourself a better future, or blowing yourself up, you're going to go the other way.
Is that why the example of Mohamed Bouazizi was so captured so many people's imagination, because they could relate to that story? To be educated, but not to have the opportunities that you want.
Look at a country like Syria, 40% the unemployment rate up to the age of 35. look at also many other countries in Egypt and many places. I think economics issue is quite important. Unemployment is a key issue. Fairness, justice, transparency. I mean, they're just asking for legitimate things. They're not asking...
Where are the jobs going to come from, though? I mean, it's different here. This is an oil economy. Syria is not an oil economy. Yes. Egypt's not an oil economy. Huge population. I mean, that's where the jobs, especially given Egypt's position of leadership in the Arab world, the jobs have got to come from somewhere, haven't they?
Well, it's a very complicated story in Egypt, particularly because of the number of population, also in some of the other Arab countries. But if you have a legitimate elected government by the people, at least the people will have their own saying, contribute to the solution that they may find it important. At the same time, reduce the corruption and the change the situation to something where they can contribute and participate in that decision, look into their economy and find. I mean, Egypt has a great land. It can be a great agricultural producer. We are a huge net importer of so many things.
So it has potential.
Oh, it has potential. Each one of the countries has a great potential. It has not been just addressed properly. I mean, Tunis, between tourism and olive oil, that's the biggest part of the economy in Egypt.
But this education question is at the core of a lot of this, isn't it? I mean, one of the things that's also been very, very impressive as an outsider is to see all these young Arab men and women bilingual, trilingual, explaining to people what they want and doing so in a very clear, direct way. It's been quite extraordinary.
I mean, you ask where the jobs are going to come from, and they're going to come from people who are ready for the 21st century. And countries like the UAE have worked on, I mean, we all criticise and there's things to improve, but basically they've produced an educational system where people are globally aware. English, IT, and not embarrassed about being themselves. Whereas you have the Saudi Minister of Water and Electricity coming saying, unfortunately, we have too many people who are Quranic exegetists and not enough water engineers. So the education provides the people who are going to move forward into the knowledge economy of the future. And
do you think most young people get that, or at least get that here?
It entirely depends what the government's been doing for the last 30 years in the Ministry of Education. If you give it to the Wahhabi establishment, you have a problem. If you give it to professional educationalists, you're 2 steps ahead.
Hassan, where do you think outsiders feature in all this? Because it is very interesting. Abdulaziz was saying, you know, we've not seen American flags being burned. We've not seen Israeli flags being burned. There are other issues perhaps that we need to address, but this is internal to the Arab world. So in that sense, do you think outsiders really have much of a role that they can play?
I think they have a role in, number one, keeping others at bay, keeping it and sort of clearing the field so that this can play out, number one. Number two, I think that they need to support the creation or support the cultivation of nascent forms of institutions. One of the most dangerous things that maybe the word dangerous is not right, but one of the most important things that you face now are there aren't enough institutions to support democracy. You may be able to have a vote, but that's not necessarily democracy.
Not the same.
Exactly.
But I mean, that was an interesting point about Libya. I mean, once you get rid of the Gaddafis, assuming they're on their way out, what do you have left of a civil society?
What supports civil society, and in turn, what supports a democracy?
But that's very different. Egypt has got many institutions. Syria has got many institutions, despite their past. So again, it's different in different places.
I think Egypt is a bellwether. I think where Egypt goes will determine whether this entire Arab Spring is successful or not, and whether it actually puts us on a proper course for the region, or whether it goes in a different direction.
Okay. The other thing the outside world is very interested in is, of course, the price of oil, which we're paying greatly for at the moment. I mean, how significant is that going to be? Because you write about that all the time. I mean, do you see the price of oil certainly being $115 a barrel and more?
It's gone up, and I think the market was bullish anyway, and I think we saw this spike up when Egypt started because people were worried about access through the Suez Canal, and it went up even more. Now the question is, you know, when can Libya come back? At what rate can Libya come back? And if you look at history, every oil price spike has actually been related to events in the Middle East, whether it's the Islamic Revolution in Iran, the oil embargo, the Middle East wars, and it's we're relying too much now on one country, which is Saudi Arabia, to make up for the loss from Libya. So your spare capacity is very, very thin at the moment. So it couldn't support another disruption, be it by, a natural disaster or or political upheaval. So I think the market is on edge, and that's being reflected. Plus, you know, the risk factor is very, very fair, has been multiplied. But of course, that's also creating fears of stagflation, which is, you know, slow economic growth, higher prices. We've seen higher food prices, commodities across the board, metals, gold, you know, as a safe haven. And what the countries in the region are doing is they're not really going to benefit fully. They will make maybe $1 trillion in oil revenue this year, according to the IEA, but they're throwing it at their people, not necessarily in the right places, not necessarily in education perhaps, but Saudi Arabia is throwing billions
of unrest, basically,
to ward off the potential of unrest, you know, giving handouts basically to the people. But it's only Band-Aid. It's not going to be enough to fix the structural changes that you have to fix for a sort of future society.
The other big giant in all this that we've touched on very briefly is Iran itself and Iran's role, because the whole question of the future of Iran has got actually quite similar problems to Arab countries in terms of, you know, quite educated young people who feel they haven't got enough opportunities. Iranians, like Arabs, can do well almost everywhere, but sometimes not in their home country. I mean, how do you think that's going to play out in terms of Iran's relationship with the rest of the Gulf?
Well, we have witnessed a very serious move this week. Kuwait have decided to three of the diplomats to leave Kuwait, and also Bahrain have called their ambassadors, and Kuwait they call their ambassador. There is a great tension here because it has been seen that strong Iranian intervention in the domestic politics of the region by escalating the sectarian issue there and bringing and moving
the
Sunni Shia issues and so on that one. So I think this is an important dimension. I think at the same time we don't believe, I mean, the Iranian, they may benefit of higher oil prices now to bring an additional cushion for the domestic issue. But at the same time, we think the reformist movement in Iran will continue, and they will be affected on the medium and long term also by what's happening in the Arab world. There's a snowball effect. We will see it in different places and so. But somehow the events taking place in the Arab world is much more faster than what's happening in Iran. So the Iranian wanted to get an advantage by that, and we have heard them saying this is an extension of the Islamic revolution there, which is not true. This is why, as I said before, we have not seen a green flag.
It's wishful
also,
thinking, perhaps.
and we have not seen, you know, that American-Israeli flag being burned. So it's very much driven by the domestic issue. If I may just a little point in the education, I think, like Kate said, the government in the region will spend massively also in the education. I think this awareness is there since we are in an education institution here. You know, a country like Saudi Arabia now, they spend 27% of their budget in education. They have more than 120,000 students studying outside. You know, perhaps 20,000 of them only in UK and about 30,000 in the US. So there is a lot of awareness and you know, a huge number of doctors studying in Canada, more than 4,000. You know,
just from Saudi Arabia.
Just from Saudi
Arabia. But that's
Arabia.
going to change Saudi Arabia, isn't it?
That will help.
These people come back.
Oh yes, when these people they come back with better education, with more 21st century, you see, knowledge, it will help a lot, you see, to change even the current domestic education, which is under the process. They're looking at the modernization of the program, particularly in mathematics and science and so, because they realize that's important. We've seen now an important program on the issues of modern school, using more you know, technology, changing the curriculum, allocating a special budget for the modernization of the whole education system, and more university. Now we have 25 university, more than 1 million students at the Saudi university domestically.
But I mean, the pace of change in Saudi Arabia has been glacially slow, hasn't it?
Yes. And there was expectations the day of rage. It didn't happen, yeah. And it doesn't look as though it's going to be very much reform there very quickly.
I introduced the subject of Iran just in the
yes.
last couple of minutes. I'd like to talk just a little bit more about that. I mean, how do you see that playing out? Because I know from Iranians that they say both those who wish for reform and those who wish to stop reform in Iran are looking very carefully at how, for example, Libya is being handled.
Well, the whole Arab world watched the Green Revolution a year ago, and you had the sophisticated discussion between Ahmadinejad's government and the opposition, discussing even the nature of what the supreme leader was about. There was a big constitutional discussion. It didn't go anywhere, but the Arab world said, "My God, these guys can talk." Now suddenly Iran is looking to the Arab world, saying these guys have moved ahead. But on the oil price, Ahmadinejad's now got a decent oil price and he can keep funding his government for a very long way. I think he's pretty secure.
Which means he can stay in power, he can be secure. It's a very complicated country, Iran.
Well, he has 2 years to the election, doesn't he? You know, I wouldn't be so sanguine about the direction. I think that Iran has huge challenges and that they're facing right now. And just as important, I think that with the Arab Spring, you know, the entire attraction to Iran and what's been happening over the past, say, 5-6 years has sort of been dissolved. I mean, it no longer has the attraction that it may have had before to young Arabs who now see it in-house. They have the revolutions on their soil,
other models,
and they're speaking in Arabic, and they're doing it in their own way.
That is quite important, isn't it? I mean, because you introduced the thought that there are models here for change in the Arab world itself, and that's really important.
Yes, but I don't think Iran, I mean, don't forget, Iran is under sanctions, international sanctions, EU, UN, US, you name it. They're not getting as much foreign investment. In fact, they're getting hardly any at all. The only ones that are operating there are the Chinese, maybe some Malaysian companies. And they are needing to fund a lot of their own projects. So the high oil price is going to be poured into they have to maintain their production because they still rely very heavily on oil. But in Iran, you don't really have public opinion because you're under sanctions, because you're isolated. It was a bit like Iraq. Saddam was able to consolidate his power because he was under sanctions. So they can repress, they can stamp down on the opposition and not allow it to happen. But I don't think they're in such a great position. If there's turmoil in Syria, Syria is their only real ally in the region. You've got the whole axis of Hezbollah, Syria, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Syria, and Iran. So I think that's also going to be key as to how much of a role Iran can play in the region.
We'll leave it there, Kate, because that's all for this special edition from Dateline from Dubai at the Men's College here in the Gulf. Our thanks to our hosts at the Higher Colleges of Technology. We'll be back in London next week. Goodbye.